Hello, and welcome to another microclass from Disasterwise, a series of quick dives into the myth, maths, and management of crisis and disaster. Today I'll be talking about disaster management, what it is, and just as importantly, what it isn't, as well as how it relates to emergency management, humanitarian coordination, and disaster risk reduction. Before I start, let me just say a couple of things to put the subject in context. The term disaster management is not just the preserve of full-time professional specialists and blue light emergency services. It includes anyone involved in making or influencing life and death decisions, including politicians, mayors, and diplomats, as well as aid workers, corporate executives, military officers, and civil defense volunteers. And the second thing is that a recent study by Cambridge University in the UK found consistent and repeated patterns of poorly integrated response activities and disaster managers inadequately trained for the requirements of the job. With disaster risk rising faster than our capacity to control it and growing demands for accountability and disaster justice, a new, coherent approach to enhancing education in disaster management is urgently needed. And to a degree, that's what this microclass seeks to address. My name is James Shepherd-Barron. I'm a disaster risk management consultant, part-time academic, and founder of Disasterwise.org and the International Disaster Management Association. Disaster management is where disaster risk reduction, emergency management, and humanitarian coordination meet. I'll come back to this in a minute, but the thing to notice here is that disaster management is not the same thing as either humanitarian coordination, emergency management, or disaster risk reduction. It's the sum of all three. Disaster management is wider in scope, larger in scale, and almost always multinational in nature. Depending on the size and capacity of the country involved, emergency management refers to critical incidents and emergencies which can be dealt with using existing capacity at national level. Disaster management is sometimes called international disaster management to make this distinction clear. So, what is disaster management? Disaster management is defined as the theory and practice of organizing an integrated, collaborative, multi-sectoral, and multinational approach to reducing the risk of excess death and destruction through all phases of the disaster management cycle. This is a bit of a mouthful, so before unpacking each of these words in more detail, let's remind ourselves what this cycle actually looks like. The disaster management cycle is made up of 6 distinct but overlapping phases: risk, which includes prevention; resilience, including adaptation; readiness, including preparedness; response, recovery, and reconstruction. Disaster management involves all 6 phases. When applied to the process of reducing disaster risk, integrating each phase moves affected communities on from the doom loop of respond, recover, repeat. And this is essentially what disaster management is all about achieving. Emergency management and humanitarian coordination refer, for the most part, to those phases which deal with emergency response, i.e. those bits I've highlighted in pink here that involve immediate preparedness and post-disaster early recovery, as well as response coordination. Humanitarian coordination is essentially the same thing as emergency management in terms of what phases it covers, but being international in nature, it involves many more organizations, more complex systems, and a more complicated architecture. And I'll come back to this as well in a minute. Another way of looking at all this involves understanding how disaster management is positioned vis-à-vis the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction at one end of the spectrum and incident management at the other. And let me go through these quite quickly one by one. Disaster risk reduction refers to an international policy framework and series of national goals specified within the UN-endorsed Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030, whose expected outcome is a substantial reduction in disaster risk and losses in lives, livelihoods, and health, and in the economic, physical, social, cultural, and environmental assets of persons, businesses, communities, and countries. And this is the paradigm in which disaster risk management works. The reduction of disaster risk is the policy objective of disaster risk management. Its implementation involves reducing the vulnerability and exposure of at-risk populations, together with building the capacity of a community, organization, or society to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from disaster shocks. By understanding and managing risk, major reductions in disaster loss can be achieved. Disaster risk management is a wider idea than disaster management and describes the process of applying disaster risk reduction policies and strategies to the prevention of new disaster risk and the mitigation of residual risk. As we have already seen, disaster management applies to all 6 phases of the risk resilience, readiness, response, recovery, and reconstruction cycle, and describes the process of converting policy into practice. It's the responsibility of national governments to do this, but disasters know no borders. Neither does any single government have the monopoly on technical know-how or resources. This means that almost all operational planning includes international input of one sort or another. Think of what it requires to issue a tsunami alert in the Pacific Ocean, for example. It also, of course, involves multinational response when national capacities have been overwhelmed, or in those not so rare cases where the government is either deemed by UN Security Council resolution to be venal or has become somehow incapacitated. Emergency management concerns itself with critical incidents at national and subnational level for which national blue light emergency response services have sufficient capacity. It's just a matter of scale and resources, therefore. And this is potentially confusing, as some countries prefer to declare a national emergency rather than a disaster. And the best way to think about this is to think of the US, where the governor of an individual state can declare an emergency when it thinks it has the capacity to deal with it, but it becomes a disaster when either neighboring states are also affected or they have been requested to send additional resources. Above a certain scale, a federal disaster can also be declared. Humanitarian coordination captures how the international response mobilization mechanism is managed within a government-led disaster management umbrella. To work, it must collaborate, not control, must complement, not substitute, while docking seamlessly with existing national disaster management systems. It's basically the way the international humanitarian system organizes itself, so that the various UN agencies involved don't trip over each other, and international non-governmental partners don't trip over the UN. Being humanitarian in nature, there is inevitably a certain tension between the principles of impartiality, independence, and neutrality, and the more directive approach taken by national governments. Returning to definitions, let me explain quickly what the words international, disaster, risk, and management mean. Pretty self-evident what the word international entails: any emergency planning or disaster response and recovery mechanism that involves multinational input. It brings international perspective, experience, current best practices, and physical and financial resources to national planning, response, and recovery efforts. But forging partnerships across national boundaries can be challenging. Individuals and organizations often have objectives, ways of working, and operational mandates that are not aligned. Different cultures and languages make it difficult to find common ground. International disaster management, then, is further complicated by the number of organisations involved and the complexity of the national and international systems needed to coordinate them all. This organogram from the Typhoon Haiyan response in the Philippines in 2014 gives you an insight into the kind of complexity involved. The thing to notice is how the national and the international systems don't compete but complement each other by docking at the cluster level. This is the bit that I've highlighted in pink here. In principle, with the national counterparts taking the lead. A disaster is more than an incident or a national emergency, and each country will have its own criteria for declaring when an emergency or critical incident has turned into one. But to be formally registered, a hazard event must have killed 10 or more people, affected 100 more, and/or be of such a scale that international resources have been requested. Disasters are what happen when natural phenomena or human-induced hazards collide with human behavior to disrupt and temporarily overwhelm local coping capacities. So-called natural disasters are not divine tragedies ordained by capricious gods, but are, like other categories of disaster, social constructs, the product of interactions between different types of hazard and historical, social, and political forces. They are caused, therefore, by social vulnerability just as much as they are by physical hazard, which is why some in the academic community balk at using the term natural, when what is meant is that the hazard was a naturally occurring phenomenon. Disasters are also processes, not events, and long-term processes at that, the result of decades of accumulated risk interacting with vulnerable communities ill-prepared to cope with or adapt to accelerating drivers of risk, such as climate change, ecological degradation, or unplanned urbanization. Let me quickly introduce the word risk, even though it's not actually in the International Disaster Management title. Risk is a function of likelihood and consequence. As such, it's the way we measure uncertainty. Humans, being filled with innate heuristic and learned biases, find it very difficult to properly assess it. For example, we systematically misperceive the probabilities of consequences of natural hazard events, consistently overestimating the likelihood of low probability events, while underestimating those of higher probability. More recent events have a greater impact on our behavior than earlier ones too. Disaster risk involves a brutal calculus made up of a complex interplay between hazard, human behavior, vulnerability, exposure, resilience, and governance. I call this stochastic interplay the calculus of calamity, and I use this pseudo-equation as a sort of mind map, because it's important to have a conceptual understanding of how these different elements manifest as disaster risks. I unpack this in more detail elsewhere, but in the meantime, I'll take this opportunity to highlight that management, or rather poor management, constitutes a disaster risk in its own right, as does the perception of relative and residual risk. In disaster terms, management is the art and science of taking risk-informed decisions, increasing allocative efficiency, and improving operational performance. It does not mean quite the same thing as coordination or leadership, though all these three terms are used more or less interchangeably in the aid world. And for this, it helps to have an operating system, a strategic operational framework, if you like, that provides an agreed roadmap for making these risk-informed decisions, increasing allocative efficiency, and improving operational performance. This makes explicit what was previously implicit, and will, for example, clarify when a particular decision will be made by consensus or by diktat. Both are valid even in disaster response operations. Despite management still seeming to be more art than science, a certain level of professional competence must be assumed when life and death decisions are being made. This is systematically lacking at the moment, especially at the international level, as I pointed out earlier, hence the need for a professional association for international disaster managers. Well, thanks for your time. I hope you found this short microclass useful. If you want to know more about disaster management or any other disaster-related topic, please take a look at disasterwise.org, where you can also subscribe and add constructive commentary. And if you want to know how to join the International Disaster Management Association, see idm-asoc.org. Stay safe wherever you are, and until the next time, goodbye.